Mr. Chairman, you're live on YouTube.
Okay, we'll bring this meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Senator Driscoll.
Excused?
Senator Garou.
Here.
Senator Larson.
Here.
Senator Smith.
Here.
And Chairman Salzar.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great. First Senate file up is Senate File 175, Unemployment Insurance Coverage Period. Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Before you is Senate File 175. There is a small appropriation, at least in the big world that we deal with, of $18,000, and it relates to a software change for renaming part of the agency to from unemployment to reemployment insurance commission. And the agency indicated that they were going to require $18,000 for programming, and that's the request, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Any questions? Stand for questions.
Remind the committee that we're dealing with the appropriation only, not the policy. Questions? Any questions? Okay, any public comment? Yes, please.
Thank you. Hello, I am Liz Gagan, and I am the Director of the Department of Workforce Services. And I just wanted to make a couple, and I'll be very, very brief, comments. During the committee meeting yesterday, a committee member did bring up, maybe it would be a good idea to cut the weeks back even further. And I just want to point out that if the weeks kind of get cut back further, that does cause problems for workforce services. Part of the UI tax does come to the agency. It's called the Employment Support Fund. And we use the Employment Support Fund for two purposes. One is to run the UI program. We don't receive enough money from the federal government to run the program properly. And then the other use of the ESF funds are for our reemployment purposes in the agency. We use it in our Wagner-Pizer area, which is our job board and provides services to businesses. We use it with vocational rehabilitation, and then just our general workforce center. So I just want to alert the committee that when UI taxes do go down, that can cause a fiscal impact to our agency.
Other questions? Senator Garou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Director, good afternoon. Would it be fair to say that our UI fund is probably one of the healthiest in the country?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Garou, yes.
Yes. And if I can follow up.
Yes, Senator.
Because of that, that gives us a great deal of latitude to work in these areas. And so I guess I don't have any questions. I just want to let you know I really appreciate what y'all do. It's a great fund, and I think this is a worthy appropriation. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, any other public comment? Any other public comment? I will close public comment. Action for the committee?
Move the bill.
Moved. A second?
Second.
Any discussion? Roll call.
Roll call vote for Senate File 0175. Senator Driscoll.
Aye.
Senator Garou.
Aye.
Senator Larson.
Aye.
Senator Smith.
Aye.
Chairman Salzar.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 5 ayes to pass.
Okay, the next file up before us is Senate File 189. Mr. President. Welcome, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Mr. Chairman. I know you have a huge docket in front of you this afternoon, or this noon hour, so I will keep my comments brief, and I brought some legal experts with me here to answer any questions too, so we can speed things up. Okay, Senators, what we have before you is amendments to the Uniform Commercial Code, where we talk about investment securities. This came about, somebody asked me a question, just point blank. When you buy stock through a brokerage like, say, Fidelity or one of the big brokerages, do you actually own the stock? It's on right here. I'll talk louder. Do you actually own it? If something were to happen and they were to go kapooey tomorrow, would you own your stock? And I said, well, of course. Well, not so much, maybe. So that's the impetus for this bill. And I'll give you a summary of what the bill does, and then these gentlemen can introduce themselves and walk you through the technicalities of the bill. But updates to the Uniform Commercial Code, specifically on provisions on investment securities, addressing the legal framework governing securities and intermediaries and entitlement holders. Key provisions of the bill, it clarifies that the local law of the securities intermediaries jurisdiction, Wyoming, covers issues related to investment securities. This will strengthen property protection for entitlement holders, ensuring that securities held by the intermediaries remain the rightful property of investors and are not subject to the claims by the intermediaries' creditors. It modifies priority rules, ensuring that entitlement holders' claims take precedence over creditors of the intermediary in cases where financial assets are insufficient, so keep that in mind, and repeals current certain outdated priority and applicability rules that conflict. So with that, I'll turn it over to Don Grandy.
Yes, sir. Welcome.
Chairman Salazar, members of the committee, my name's Don Grandy. I'm an attorney in private practice. Been working with the Uniform Commercial Code for some time. I represent True North Public Policy, which is a public policy entity that we formed to work with David Webb on this issue. So technically, that's who I'm representing. But I provided written testimony to the committee, and I believe President Beitman will provide that to you, and it does have some hyperlinks to additional information on the back. So if it's given electronically, you can link through that. So I'm just going to touch about the basics of the bill from the state statute standpoint, and then Mr. Webb will talk about how we got in this predicament. So the Uniform Commercial Code had a significant rewrite of Article 8, which deals with investment securities. It's called the 1994 Article 8 revision, and it was passed in Wyoming in 1998. Excuse me, 1998. And so this change to the Uniform Commercial Code really flipped property terminology on its head. Instead of being a shareholder, you're now an entitlement holder. So when you go to your broker and say, I want to buy 100 shares of Apple Computer, the broker executes that sale through a custodian, and it puts that 100 shares on your statement, on your online account. But what you actually received is what's called a security entitlement. It's not a stock. You're not a stockholder, you're called an entitlement holder. And that's an important distinction because the entitlement holders also have, there's other people that can have access to those entitlements, and that's the rub here. So that security entitlement language, the securities intermediaries language, all was just very confusing, and it ended up undermining property rights. And so basically what this bill is intended to do is just restore those property rights. When you get to your code in 34.18, Section 8, Article 8, Section 5, it deals with all of these new rules, these new words, terminology. And 8.511 has basically says that you as the entitlement holder, you as the individual investor have priority to your own asset over the general creditors of the broker or a custodian, except. And they always leave out those two exceptions. So the two exceptions are in 35.8.511B, which gives an exception to the secured creditor of a securities intermediary that has control, has priority to your asset if the intermediary files for bankruptcy, goes insolvent. Exception in C says that a depository trust corporation or another clearing corporation always has priority over the individual investor. So the beauty of this law, and I do have to tip a hat to the people that drafted it, is that nothing changes. As long as there's no insolvency, no financial crisis, people can buy and trade the stock, they get the dividends, they vote the shares, proxy, nothing changes until there is a significant insolvency. And And that's what we're concerned about here, and that's what we're trying to fix. And so I'm just going to touch briefly on a couple of the objections you'll hear from opponents, and then I'll turn over to
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Webb.
Senator Smith?
Before we get too far down the road, may I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
And Mr. Rainey, is that right?
Grandy's.
Grandis?
Grandy.
Grandy, my bad, okay. Guess I'm one of those that didn't hear very well. Question for you, how widespread in the industry is this security entitlement, security intermediary thing versus stockholder? Like, and it started happening back in the mid-90s, right, where they started like, finagling with the title. Right? This is something I've been reading about for decades. But I want to know how widespread it is, if you could just like address that, because that way people could have a better idea of the problem.
Certainly. Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Senator? It's widespread. This move to digital certificates took place a long time ago. Wyoming, you've been on the cutting edge of dealing with a lot of digital assets with what you did with Title 3429, dealing with digital assets. This bill dovetails into that. But essentially, the security entitlement is created the moment your broker enters that trade on your account. That creates the security entitlement. Now, your broker doesn't have those shares. A custodian or a depository trust corporation actually has the shares, but your security entitlement is entered right then. I don't have the specifics, it's at least 90% of the securities out there are in digital form now versus paper certificates that we used to have. I might look young, but I've been around for a while. And when I was younger, we had stock certificates. I worked for a trust company early in my career. They had bonds, bearer bonds, coupon bonds. They don't have that anymore. Treasuries aren't available in physical form. Some stocks you can get in physical form, but most people don't do it because of the convenience of having it in digital form. But,
Mr. Chair, I get
Senator Smith?
I get that, but the way that they're titling it, they can still title
Yes.
it properly and not, and even if it is digital. How widespread is that? Like, so like, let's say, people know Fidelity and Vanguard. How are they titling these assets?
Mr. Chairman? Yes, Senator. This is across the board. There isn't anybody who's not dealing with this system. Everything travels up to the Depository Trust Corporation level. That's where the actual certificates are held. And it's the account holders with Depository Trust, which would be like your brokers. They all have accounts and they own Depository Trust. They own accounts up at that level. And then the trades are just digitally moved back and forth at the end of each day. It's called, clearing or netting. But it's universal. They're all held this way. Mr. Webb can speak to the fact that it's international, that this is what's in place.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Driscoll?
Thank you, Mr. Grandy. Following on the same line, and I get where you're going. I don't disagree with it at all, President Biden. Are we going to be able to shove these huge corporations into Wyoming's box? We all sign off when we do it, 180 pages of disclosures. Is JP Morgan or Fidelity going to say we do it, or are we just going to lose people we can do business with in the state of Wyoming?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's a good question. I'll address it, and Mr. Webb might be in a better position to address that. Certainly, the individual, the lead drafter of this 1994 amendment, he's called the reporter for the drafting committee. After it was done, he went on a speaking tour and a writing tour, and he basically said that the intent behind this 1994 revision was Armageddon planning for the financial sector. So, because the genesis for this started in 1987, 88 with that stock market crash, Black Monday, and they were worried that would take down the biggest, too big to fail banks. So it was put into place for them. And they are taking advantage of that, obviously, because there's very little risk now on their part. So they're not going to be happy, certainly, if states start pushing back on this through the Uniform Commercial Code. The beauty for us is that the changes they made to Article 8, primarily Article 8, Section 5, are the underpinning for this across the country. It was done at the state level. It can be protected at the state level. We don't have to wait on Washington. This is a federalism, private property type issue.
Mr. Chairman, follow up, please. That being said, This obviously is model legislation, correct? This piece of model legislation is running in some other states.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, no, it's not. This is legislation that I've drafted
So,
and have provided to people around the country who are interested in this topic. Didn't come from any organization other than me.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. So we're going to be the first state that checks this. If we pass this, we're going to be number one. And what are the results a year from now if we find out that, for me, I trade with E-Trade, that E-Trade tells me that they'll no longer do business with me? Because that's my concern.
Yes,
is,
it's a concern, Chairman.
I really don't want to have to deal with some third-level broker. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm pretty comfortable with the guys that are there.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, our hope, well, it can answer that in two ways. This bill is moving forward in a number of states. Mr. Webb and I were in South Dakota yesterday testifying for the House Committee, and it did pass that committee going to the floor. It's moving forward in about 7, possibly 8 states right now. So it just depends on who's first. And Mr. Webb has opinions on the benefits of being first in this situation. But our hope is that this process, this fix that we've got here is pretty surgical. It's just designed to return some property rights to individuals to sort of get away from this priority that the banks can come in and take it in a significant financial crisis. It's not a cure-all. Our hope would be that this would bring the Uniform Law Commission or other entities back to the table to fix it. And
Mr. Chair,
yes, Commissioner.
Mr. Grandis, I think what my good friend here is trying to say is, so if we pass this, if Wyoming passes this, we're not going to, the people in the state of Wyoming aren't going to be banned from using, Ameritrade or whoever, because they're not going to want to do business with us because they can't title their assets properly. That's not the case, right? They can easily fix this at their level, correct?
Certainly. Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's absolutely right. This change that we're doing here doesn't change anything, really. As far as, like I said, the bill was drafted, or the statute was drafted in such a way that it seems appearances are normal. As the appearance of normalcy, there isn't anything crazy about it. People are buying and selling stocks and everything. The only thing that this change does is if there is a systemic financial crisis, then the big banks can't grab the assets. You get your assets back. So it doesn't have to cause E-Trade or Fidelity or anybody else any heartburn to do work here, because it doesn't change the plumbing, as Mr. Webb says, of the securities industry. Knowing human nature, there may be some repercussions on whoever's the first to stick their head up out of the gopher hole, right? But there doesn't have to be any, because this bill doesn't change anything, other than it removes the priority that the too big to fail banks have over
Mr. Chair,
customers' assets.
it does change the title. It changes the way it's titled, right?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, it does not change the way it's titled. The only place that your name shows up for your stocks is on the account of your broker.
Okay.
When it moves, the broker doesn't own the stocks, though. It moves to the custodial level. Your name doesn't show up anymore. And so
I'm good with it. I think it's good.
it doesn't change all it does, it doesn't change the title to anything. All it does is remove the priority that's been given to the big banks in the event of insolvency.
So, members, we have a full docket, and I do want to give Mr. Webb a few minutes. So, Mr. Webb?
Thank you, Chairman.
Yep.
Senators, thank you. Oh, here we go.
Got to read it.
Okay, so, thank you, Chairman, Senators. I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm also, by birth, I'm also a citizen of Sweden. I have a view into these developments in Europe as well. I'll say I started as a young guy in New York in investment banking, mergers and acquisitions, private equity, eventually ran hedge funds through the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble and bust. I have to say my clients at my peak were a former U.S. Treasury Secretary, a former chairman of the CFR, a former president of the Fed, and I've dealt with these issues deeply on a high level. and hands-on. So what we're dealing with here is a shifting of certainty of control of the property from the owners, the investors, to the secured creditors. And this has been done in a very sophisticated way over decades of implementation to make that happen. So if you are dealing with, if you're questioning someone in the industry about this, one thing they cannot tell you, and they certainly won't put it in writing, is that if there is an insolvency in the financial system, that you can take back your property out of the insolvency. They will not put that in writing, and they can't tell you that because it's no longer the case. And if you can't take your property back out of the insolvency, what does that mean? It means it's not your property. It's no longer your property. It's as simple as that. That is the proof, very simply. The second thing is, how do we know that? So when this was implemented quietly in the UCC in all 50 states in the US, then they set about forcing this on the rest of the world. So questions about how pervasive this has now been implemented globally, including in Europe. It took them a long time to do it, but they did it. And I was there through those efforts. And the EU formed something called the Legal Certainty Group in 2004. And what they meant by legal certainty is making it legally certain that the secured creditors keep the assets in a systemic failure. So the Legal Certainty Group, the Europeans were being pushed to do this. They sent a detailed questionnaire to the New York Fed. This is the Fed. This is the business end of the Fed. And it's a gift to us because we have a definitive response written by lawyers for the New York Fed provided to the EU Legal Certainty Group in March of 2006, in which the Fed explains exactly how this operates under the operation of what? Article 8, which is exactly what we are addressing now.
Let me ask either one of you, how would you define systemic failure? What are we protecting ourselves? What event would protect individuals by?
Okay, what is being contemplated, there are documents within the industry where what is contemplated, it only requires the failure of one major member, one or two major members of the central clearing counterparties, where the derivatives complex is all now cleared. Okay. And so that will, in their recent Financial Stability Board documents within the BIS about how this will unfold, and that will produce what they call a margin spiral, which is as asset prices fall, more and more collateral is called to back this. And okay, so the first proof is this response from the Fed. Absolutely irrefutable. This is not conjecture. And the Fed explains that the investor is always vulnerable to the insolvency of the intermediary. And the investor only has a right to a pro rata share of what remains in the pool after the secured creditors exercise on their property over which they have control. The second document that is very powerful, irrefutable, is Policy Perspectives, which was published in the UCLA Law Review in 1996. So this is 2 years after the amendments, but when they were being promulgated. That was written by James S. Rogers, who was the drafter, as Don mentioned. This is the man who wrote the amendments. And he explains that the people in the industry will say this was about modernization. He explains this was Armageddon planning. This is not our term. This is the term of the man who wrote the amendments. And what does he mean by Armageddon planning? It is making sure that that all of the collateral will be swept to the GSIBs, globally systemically important banks. And so they've known this for a long time. So that's a very important document. Thirdly, we have the case of the Lehman bankruptcy. Now, the banking lobby will say, well, no one lost any money in the Lehman bankruptcy. What's there to see here? There's nothing to see here. Well, what actually happened in the Lehman bankruptcy is that the moment the bankruptcy was filed, all client accounts were frozen. All client accounts, retail accounts, and including the biggest institutional players, all of their accounts were frozen. They had no right to take their property back. That means it's not your property. Now, the small client accounts, after some weeks and months, though that business was sold to another firm. That was the only way those clients got access to their accounts again. Now, the more shocking thing is the institutional clients. Unbeknownst to them, Lehman was using the pooled client collateral under swap contracts to finance Lehman. Now, you might think that's shocking, but this is going on all the time, everywhere. All of the pooled assets are used without restriction and free of payment all the time. This only mattered because Lehman failed. Otherwise, the game of musical chairs would have gone on.
Let me, I apologize, we're at
Yes,
real time
understood.
constraints, but I did want to give you, Mr. Webb, I get it, I'm on board.
Yes.
So, no, any other questions for either of our witnesses? Mr. President.
I'll just say the last, as a closing statement here, I'm of the mind if you can't hold it, you don't own it. I'd much rather own physical gold than a certificate that says, hey, you can cash this in for gold at any time. Do you really own it? No. And same with stocks. And the too big to fail thing, we should have learned our lesson in 2008.
Yep.
Obviously, we have not, and this protects them. It's a heads they win, tails you lose proposition, so I hope we can fix it.
I hope I'm wrong, but I think we may have another episode sometime. And, Mr. Vice President Chair.
Is there anything out there prohibiting me from holding it myself? I mean, in the old days, I held stock certificates. Is there anything stopping me from buying
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Senator,
stocks from
it's
our
an
broker?
excellent question. Certain stocks are still available in certificate form, and you can request that from your broker-dealer. They do charge a little extra for that convenience fee. But the problem, and then mutual funds are primarily all digital. There are a few that you can get certificates. Exchange-traded funds are all digital. There are no certificates. Treasuries are all certificates. So you can, but it's pretty limited. But the bigger issue here is that for your constituents, the bulk of their assets, the bulk of their investment assets are going to be in their IRA, their 401k, or their pension. You can't hold those physically because it's prohibited. So yes, but it's one of those answers where yes, but it doesn't really change the subject.
Mr. Chair, I just have one quick statement for Mr. Grandis. So if I understood you correctly, it's about priority. And so if we have an IRA and we have systemic failure, we're taking the account holder, the owner, and moving them to the top, like we're first priority, not the bank that holds the assets and so forth, correct? Like,
Mr. Chairman
failure.
and Senator, it does get confusing because it's oftentimes the same players, that the bank will also be the custodian and it
Right,
may also
I
be
get
the
it.
broker, right?
There's
So
lots
it's a
of
little
players.
confusing
Yeah,
in there.
yeah.
What we're talking about here is the bank that extends the credit to a custodian or broker-dealer. If that broker-dealer is insolvent, it can just grab all of that collateral, because the beauty of it is it's all pooled.
Yeah.
People can say that the argument that you'll hear from the opposition is that this 8511B only deals with margin accounts. That's where an individual can pledge their stocks to borrow money from the broker to buy more stocks. That's clearly not the case. It doesn't just involve margin accounts. We're talking about the debt of the intermediary. The custodian or broker has gone to the bank and used the collateral that they've got to secure their loan. At that custodian level, your name doesn't appear anywhere. All the assets are pooled. They don't know whether that's yours in a margin account, yours in an IRA, yours anywhere. It's just, it's pooled, it's fungible, and it's used.
I want to thank both of you. I know you came from a distance. Appreciate it.
Support the revision to Article 8. Oh, sorry, Don Kleiss. I'm retired. And I've always been involved in the political process, but just by voting, until I learned about this about a year ago. And I decided it was so important, I needed to get involved. And that's why I've been here for the past 3 weeks. This makes 4 weeks. And that's why I'm talking to you today.
It's good to have you there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is so serious. Most people, and I've been talking to as many legislators as I can, and that's been rather difficult. But this is so serious, this could, if there's another systemic financial crisis, we could literally lose, and correct me if I'm wrong, we could literally lose our $29 billion that we have in our 11 or 12 sovereign wealth funds here with the state. Not to mention all the IRAs, all the 401ks, pension funds, investment accounts, any type of custodial account, that could be wiped out. I mean, can you imagine the fallout from that if something like that happened? That's what we're looking at. Now, I can't get into all the technical details that Mr. Grande did or Mr. Webb, but that essentially is what we're looking at. And that's basically all I have to say.
No, I appreciate your testimony. I have the same view as you on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I don't want to be an alarmist, but I definitely believe, I think this is needed. But
Yes.
in any event, other questions? Other questions? Thank you. Thank you very much. Other testimony? Anyone else like to testify? Yes, please come forward. Yes, sir. Good to see you.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I guess afternoon. This is just a small-town lawyer out of Lander, but I am here on behalf of the Uniform Loss Commission as one of Wyoming's commissioners. And I'm also here on behalf of Wyoming's Banking Association that represents all of your community banks. And in order to keep this sweet and short, I'll tell you right now, I disagree with the presenters of the bill. I don't see the sky is falling right now. Doesn't mean that we don't have issues. But understand what the Uniform Commercial Code is. It's uniform. That means all the states are here doing this stuff. In answer to one of the questions, what will this do with Wyoming? Could very well make sure Wyoming doesn't get included in things. Why would they deal with a state that has a different set of laws than everybody else? And that can be very problematic. And remember, what is the UCC other than that? It's governing these securities, both from a federal and a state level. And it's these combined. And these things make sure that we have everything that we need to work. That doesn't mean that everything is solid and it'll never be changed. There's always an opportunity to make changes. And the Uniform Laws Commission recommends those. And then we look at them, and then whether we bring them to you is whether we think that fits Wyoming law or not, but we'll talk it over with every one of the legislators and see, here's what it is. But this came up, I don't know how many people has been discussed with it. So where do they have this thing wrong? Yes, these intermediaries hold the stocks. You talked about one of your E-Trades accounts. You talk about some of these, yeah, this certainly is held out there. But it's not just a contract, it's a property interest. You own that. Now, you may title it some different way, but you own it. So when you look at this, you say, what happens if something were to go bad on one of these things, you own that interest. They can't collateralize that unless you authorize it. They can't use that for something else unless you authorize it. You own it. And our laws are strictly for that. And we talk about that. The indirect holding system provides a lot of advantages for investors, such as quick and computer-based trading, secure backups of those accounts. Under our Article 8, enacted that every other state has been enacting too, an investor who owns those securities through an intermediary has that property interest, like I said, not a contract. The folks that want to make these changes focus on those two exceptions, and those are very narrow exceptions. So if you look at the first one, the exception applies to investors that consent in writing to the intermediary to borrow. And they will borrow against the security in order to buy it or to buy other securities, and they have a contractual relationship to borrow it. That's not something that they can take away from you. Under these voluntary arrangements, the UCC Article 8 prioritizes security intermediaries lender who has accepted those securities as collateral as an extension of the credit. Those people have priority. The other exception that they talked about with the secured creditors is the clearinghouse corporations. And yes, there is an exception, and it has very seldom used, if ever. The UCC Article 8 gives priority to lenders who extend credit, a secured credit, to the clearing corporation to provide the liquidity that one might need to settle a given day's trades. These are the clearinghouses. So what would happen if you said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take those two out. Well, if the exceptions are repealed, then investors would find that obtaining margin loans on their securities would be more expensive and in some cases not even available. It's also possible that the differential treatment would lead to a clearinghouse corporation's inability or even unwillingness to permit banks or brokers in a state that has eliminated this relevant exceptions to it. That does affect Wyoming. And that elimination would seriously hinder the ability of the bank or the broker to conduct business in Wyoming. The second repealing of these provisions would significantly impede commerce. Why do we have the UCC? Because we want to do business across state lines. We don't want 50 different laws when it comes to commerce. Interstate business thrives because of the UCC makes transactions predictable. If laws differed between states, companies, investors, consumers, everybody else would have to either, one, learn what every state is doing, or avoid businesses with that state or that person. At a minimum, repealing these exceptions would add unnecessary legal expenses to otherwise routine commercial transactions. And in a worst-case scenario, could cause companies to cease doing business in Wyoming. No, we talked about this, the comment was even made, oh yeah, no individuals lost money on Lehman. I don't know anybody that's lost any money yet anywhere on this because of these exceptions. I will certainly stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions? Any questions? Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Oh, yes.
Just a question, even though I know. Could you state your name for the record? Just-
Scott Meyer, Wyoming Bankers Association, Uniform Laws Commission.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Mr. Meyer.
Senator.
Well, I would say that I'm certainly not at the caliber of testimony as these other two gentlemen that were would have been to the right of me if they were sitting here. I do say that I know that when we do securities lending, we have 102% collateral that's basically in short-term bonds. And there's been some, I think some discussions about some of the procedures of banks actually using derivatives and how far they can get extended.
Mr. Treasurer, could you speak up to?
Okay, I'll get a little bit, yeah.
Yep.
Is that better? Okay, so I guess to repeat, I'm not at the caliber of these two guys who are over here. I can tell you some of the things that we do to try to protect ourselves contractually. And one is like when we do securities, we have 102% collateral in short-term bonds. To lose money, I think one of these banks would have to get way over their skis using derivatives. And that's one thing that kind of scares me. I think there's another way to proceed about this in the UCC. And I think there is a provision when so many states, decide that they want to have a change in the UCC, then they can actually present that to the Uniform Commercial Code Commission, and then they take that up. I don't recall what that number is that can actually get some movement more in unity that would necessarily provide some protection from, I'd say, the first person in and the early adapters. You kind of get a critical mass before you actually make a move. I don't know what can happen. I think there's as much, I guess, thought about what could happen negatively as to the potential of actually something falling all apart. And I do agree with the chairman. At some point in time, I think things could fall apart, all apart. You could have a bigger deal than what the Lehman and the Great Financial Crisis was. I know during the Great Financial Crisis, it took me over 30 days to get a check cashed from Wells Fargo advisors, let's say from one major bank's advisors to the bank itself. And it was my money, and I couldn't get control of it for over 30 days during the GFC. So, yeah, there's a lot of problems, and I think that, they need to be addressed. Whether this is it, I'm not going to opine one way or the other, whether this would fix the problems that we might have in the future in another great financial crisis, or would it cause more problems for people, or more problems for us, But I did give these two gentlemen, we're going to get together and we're going to talk about it a lot more.
Okay.
And so that to make sure that the state is protected contractually as much as we possibly can be.
Great.
Yep.
Questions? Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Treasurer, good afternoon. I just wanted to make sure, the comments you were just making were more talking about yourself as an individual investor, but then at the end, you kind of said something about the state of Wyoming. I want to make sure we're differentiating between the two. You're not saying the state of Wyoming and their investment vehicles are in, let me just ask you, does this bill affect the state of Wyoming and its investment portfolio, or are we talking about little Mike here who just has, a bank and a mortgage and, what happened in 401k and what happens if everything goes south?
Well, it could affect us proportionately, just as from like good old Mike or good old Kirk compared to the state, which is about 30 billion times more almost than what let's say good old Kurt has, but I think our method for protecting the state is actually to do it contractually as much as we can. These guys are, depending on how much they charge me, I might have them look at my JP Morgan, my Wells Fargo contracts.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, but Mr. Chairman, and I know we're pressed for time, but when all of a sudden we start talking about $30.9 billion, I start getting nervous.
Yeah.
I understand Mr. Fleming, our CIO, is online.
And I think Patrick is a lot more adept on some of these things and probably knows some of the protections that we have. But really, JP Morgan is one of the largest banks in the world, and Wells Fargo isn't too far behind them. I think the problem, if we have a problem, you've got bigger problems than that. Yeah.
Could I ask Mr. Fleming, I thank you for joining us. Could you kind of give me a little, just help me on this question about where we are with the state versus individuals, which I think this bill contemplates, but the differentiate between the two, or illustrate for me?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Groot, yes, thank you. Patrick Fleming, CIO for the Treasurer's Office. Yes, we're very, very different in what we do. What we do, majority of our stock is held in what's called an SMA, separately managed account, which is our street name, in Wyoming's name, not street name, which is a differentiation. Also, when we're lending, just to make sure, that is a falsehood when the fellow said we would be at risk at 19 billion. We don't even own 19 billion of stocks. But The other managers that are called commingled accounts, they're held in the manager's name, just like state of Wyoming. So these are not held, they're not used for collateral the way they do it. When we do sec lending, we do not take in equities for security, just like what would happen at Lehman. That's one thing I'll never do. You do not, even if it's 102%, a stock could go down 50%, and then you're in trouble. So we do not ever take stocks as security. We'll only take in U.S. Treasuries as security. We will lend stocks. If the stock value goes down, we're still protected. So no, we are protected from this. The individuals, I had stock at Lehman Brothers. I used to work there when it went under. And all of these things, it's in your name. As Mr. Scott Meyer commented on, they are protected in your name. Yes, you could be, the accounts were frozen and you could not get access to that right away, but it is in your name and you have a perfected interest in that ownership.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fleming. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Any other comments? Any other testimony? I'll give you 60, go ahead, Mr. Webb.
No, I would just like to, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to respond to what was just said. This is very, very important. The Fed response to the legal certainty group makes it clear, crystal clear, that even accounts that are segregated are still pooled at the higher level. This is people who are institutional investors, very sophisticated investors, want to believe that they are protected and that they can tell their clients that they are protected. But just look at the response of the Fed itself. What they're explaining is segregation is something that only occurs at the lowest level in the books and records of the first tier intermediary, the broker. This is an indirect holding system where the securities are then pooled with no specific identification to any securities. So we've been through this over and over again with institutional investors. They want to believe their accounts are segregated. It does not protect from this. Thank you.
Okay, with that. Is there a motion?
Yeah. Is there any discussion, or could I move the bill?
Okay, so we have one motion moved. Is there a second? Okay, there is a second. Okay, discussion.
Mr. Chairman, roll call on Senate File 0189. Senator Driscoll? Aye. Senator Guru?
No.
Senator Larson?
Aye.
Senator Smith?
Aye.
Chairman Salzar?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, 4 ayes, 1 no, do pass.
Thank you. Next item. Just a minute, Senator. I'll remind the committee we have about 35 minutes left, so.
So I think they'll be this pretty quick, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks, go ahead.
Are we ready? All right. So, Mr. Chairman, you'll recognize this bill, and you and Senator Grew, because this was a joint appropriations bill from last year. This was an increase in the contribution from the employees and the employer to the large retirement fund. This was vetoed by the governor last year. Mr. Chairman, I did go back and look, and in concurrence on this bill, we had adjourned when the veto occurred, and so when I went back and looked at this, we had two-thirds majority in both houses on concurrence in this bill. All it does is increase the contribution rate by both the employer and the employee by 1/4%, and it starts the firm, or the fund towards a more actuarially sound. Right now, I talked to the director, I think he's here, if you have any questions, but right now we have about a $2.5 billion liability.
Senator Hicks, can I stop you? Could we ask conversations to go out? Thank you.
So right now, there's about a $2.5 billion liability in the program. That's why that the Appropriations Committee last year took that action. Now, you did take another action. Starting next year, it will start to move the contribution rates towards an actuarially sound methodology. This would just jumpstart that effort by an additional 1 year to start moving it. And I would just remind members, this is a liability of the legislature, because we're the appropriators. And so that $2.5 billion to get us to where we're 100% actuarially sound it belongs to the legislature. And so, Mr. Chairman, that's the bill. It's the same bill you guys passed last year that we passed out of the Senate and the House. Just bring it back. It's a policy decision. It does have a fiscal note. If you just turn to the back, the cost to move that, this is the state's 0.25% for 1 year. Oh, I got the wrong bill. Here it is. So if you go to the fiscal note on that, Mr. Chairman, on the back, it's $1.7 million out of the general fund and $3.4 million out of the public school foundation fund. And that would be the state or the employer's share, our liability, by increasing each one of those as retirement contributions by 0.25%. Now, the employees are going to have to do 0.25% also. The end of the day, it's their money. But that's all this does, Mr. Chairman. It's the same bill you saw last year for those new members. Senator Larson, Senator Driscoll, you were here. I did not go back to see how you voted on this bill, but so Senator Smith would be the only one that hasn't seen that. That's all the bill does, Mr. Chairman. It's a policy decision as to whether we want to kickstart this thing and move it a little quicker along before we start the new program in 2026.
Great, thank you, Senator Hicks. Any discussion?
Quick
Senator
question.
Guru.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, thanks for being here. On the fiscal note, the 3.4 from the public school foundation, was that where we were last year?
That's half of what we were last year.
Yeah, I know, we're jump starting, but the splits were the same, the numbers are just different.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, that's because all of the school teachers and school employees are involved in the big pension plans, so that comes out of the school foundation program account to cover their cost on that. The rest of it is state government employees, non-school related.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions? No other questions? Thank you, Senator Hicks. Anyone else would like to come forward, please do. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. David Swindell, Executive Director of the Wyoming Retirement System. The Retirement Board, which just finished its meeting here in Cheyenne, does not have a position on the bill. We're neutral on it. I just here to provide facts and answer questions from the committee. I did provide the committee a handout with our analysis of the bill, as well as some reminders just to kind of what we're dealing with, is what the public employee plan is. This is sometimes referred to as the big plan. And as the good senator said, yes, it has an unfunded liability of about $2.5 billion. But last year, we did pass House Bill 83, which will gradually move rates up and achieve full funding in accordance with the funding policy, which is now incorporated in statute. So one thing for this committee to understand is in every other hearing I've been in during my time in the retirement system, when I came to the legislature and we talked about contribution rate increases, we usually express it in, this will accelerate the year in which we will reach full funding. That's no longer the case in the public employee plan, because we've established the mechanism to get us there on schedule. And what happens is if you jumpstart and have higher contributions with this bill, it just means that the contribution rate necessary to get you to that endpoint on schedule now will be a little less. So it's a benefit, but it's a different benefit than we've discussed prior. How that plays in your districts, I'm not sure. I imagine that when you go back and say, oh, we accelerated the year of full funding by 2 years, I don't know how much applause you got for that. But this will result in slightly lower rates going forward once you reach the steady state period, which will be about 4 years. The mechanism will adjust rates in 2026, probably again in 2028, and then you'll hit a steady state thing that'll go for about 19 years. And we think with this bill, that rate would be about 6 basis points less. But there's a cost to pay up front for that. And so that's the policy consideration for this committee and for the legislature. We have received some concern from some of the local employers about the impact on their budget this year and so on.
Let's stop for a minute. Okay, again, out of courtesy, let's keep the discussions in the back low. Okay, continue.
Yeah, but that's the other consideration is what the impact is near term versus far term. Beyond that, I'm here to answer any questions from the committee.
Okay, questions? Any questions? Thank you, appreciate it. Now, who else would like to talk? Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Betsy Anderson, and I'm Governor Gordon's Deputy Chief of Staff and General Counsel. I'll be brief. Just for a few reasons, I'll talk about 3 of them. The governor doesn't believe that this bill is necessary at this time. First, as Director Swindell alluded to, last year you passed a bill with the actuarially determined contribution rate. And that plan provides for an objective basis for increasing contributions to get to full funding. Therefore, this bill really isn't needed at this time. As he testified, it will not get you to full funding any earlier. It maybe means it doesn't have to work as hard. And so there is that difference, and it will make that difference. But the year full funding would not change. And why we don't think you need this at this time is, first off, I think that we really are working to try to help employees get caught up with inflation. And as we all know, we've had significant inflation. And the governor and the legislature has done a great job over the last 3 years to try to get employee salaries where they need to be. And we still have a lot more work that needs to be done. But for employees, I feel like we do a lot of pushing and pulling. You know, we give them a salary increase, and then we pull back with, oh no, your benefit contribution rates, and it's all costing more. And so at this time, we just believe this is not the time to do this. And we need to let those employees really get caught up. And then the last thing is, and this plan applies to more than just state employees. This plan has a lot of local governments. I think it's the materials that Director Swindell handed out to you. They make up a bulk of the plan. And so the great thing about the ADC is that it will be providing notice to those other employers so they have an opportunity to plan and budget for that. And that's part of that process, is when there is an increase, they'll have an opportunity, they'll get a month's notice, and they'll be able to plan for that. If we do this right now, those employers, while we've got appropriations for state entities, those employers are going to have to find that money for that employer contribution that's not currently in their budget. So for those reasons, the governor thinks that right now it's best to keep the retirement contribution rate as is and rely on the ADC. And I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you for that testimony. Questions? Senator Smith?
Just one. You said that this wouldn't help employees get caught up, but I thought that it did in terms of the fund.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Smith, if you're talking, this will not, you're talking about the plan itself to get caught up and to be fully funded. The ADC that was passed last year, it allows retirement to put together a plan. And I'm going to look at Director Swindell. He needs to tell me if I misspeak. But that plan has a defined date as to when the strategic plan for the retirement plan has a defined date as to when it will be fully funded. So you could do this increase this year, but that defined date as to when the plan is going to be fully funded is not going to change by you passing this bill. It just means that the process as the plan, it's got, I think, an objective formula. It looks at and I think it takes into account the returns the plan has made, how well they've done return-wise, to understand that unfunded liability. And they look at all those objective factors and they determines when you have increases, knowing that you want this exact date to be when you're fully funded. So yes, if you pass this today, maybe the plan wouldn't have to work as hard, as that's Director Swindell's word, so you might not have to increase quite as much over the rest of the time because you already had this increase this year, but you're not going to change the date of fully funding of the plan.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you very much, appreciate it. Anyone else wish to testify? Anyone else? Okay, I'll close public testimony. Nick, what would you like to do? Okay, there's a second. Is there any discussion? Roll call.
Mr. Chairman, roll call vote on Senate File 0187. Senator Driscoll?
Aye.
Senator Guru?
No.
Senator Larson?
No.
Senator Smith? And Chairman Salzar? Mr. Chairman, 3 ayes, 2 noes do pass.
Thank you, guys. Okay, well, that's all right. I can, 5 minutes?
You got 20 minutes.
20 minutes, that's fine, that's fine. Senator Schuler, as a sponsor, has some amendments. Those amendments, Mr. Chairman, essentially were developed by my deputy and our chief accountant, or chief financial officer.
How many amendments do you have?
They're all there. We just work them in. All it does is make the accounting.
Before you
easy.
pass out the amendments.
Okay, let's do the bill.
No, it has been my policy.
Yeah.
That we do not do amendments from the witness table, and that amendments can easily come through this committee through a member of this.
I'll sponsor them on my own bill.
Okay.
The shooters
Okay.
distributed them, I know about them.
Okay, I thought it was any senator.
Thank
It's
you.
just the committee members then.
I will be flexible today.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
They're pretty simple.
Yeah, I think most of you have seen these handouts. If you want me to leave some with the secretary, that's fine. But if you basically, Mr. Chairman, what this does is provides for a more efficient way to invest funds. Essentially, what we do right now is that we have funds. We usually spend about 80-90% of the income, and the rest of it remains. And so the funds grow, but not at a great pace. Essentially, when you do compounding, it allows you to get the highest rate of returns over a course of time. I've used 30 years because we use an assumed rate of return of 10%. We use that because it's basically we make over 12% in privates. We get an asset allocation of 25% private equity, 15% private credit. That should easily get us a 10% return over the course of that time. It's essentially the rule of 72. We get to double our money at 10% every 7.2 years. We've looking at that. If you put $100 million in for every 30 years, that's $3 billion. And that's the same, you get the same equivalent return of $1.6 billion if you have a separate fund of $26.667 billion. So it's whether you want to, basically spend $3 billion and get $1.6 billion for the next 30 years, or you try to save $26.7 billion and get that same return of $1.6 billion. Now, from my perspective, we've done really well. I think your perspective too. This year, we're basically made over $2.4 billion this last fiscal year, and that's a good return. And as far as the return we made over our benchmarks, this last year it was $420 million. Over the last 6 years, it's been over $1 billion. So $420 million just this last year, and over $1 billion over the last 6 years. What I want to do is take a very small percentage of what I would call excess returns from the work and the skill of the investment team, and put that into a more efficient manner to invest our money. So to me, it's a really simple bill, and it's a simple concept. It's the same concept that you would have if you had a college fund, or if you had any other fund where you wanted to had a use case in the future. The use case that we have in the future, and you guys are well aware of it, is that we've lost $500 to $600 million a year in energy revenue just off coal, and over another $100 million off of the coal lease bonuses. We've got almost $3 billion worth of schools built, and those schools, in the future, we're going to need basically another revenue stream to pay for those, another revenue stream to pay for further tax decreases. And what this does, if you run it, move it clear out to where, and people say, well, this is a long time, but we're going to celebrate 250 years of the United States. I believe we're going to be around here in another 250 years. I know we're going to go through some ups and downs, and I think we all have concerns about what those are going to be. But I think that if we use the best form of investing that gets you the greatest return, then we can weather those storms. And I think in 100 years, we're going to be the only state that's truly a sovereign state, because I don't know how many times you guys have heard it, well, we can't do this because we're going to lose our federal highway funding. We can't do this because we're going to use our educational funding. We can't do this bill or this good idea because we're going to lose all of our Medicaid funding. And so as long as the federal government dictates what we can do by their money, we're not going to be a sovereign, and we're not going to have the freedom, I think, that every one of you guys want to have from taxes, and the freedom that everyone wants to be able to do to make decisions not based on somebody else pulling the strings. Essentially, after 120 years, you're going to have over $10 trillion in the next investment cycle.
Okay. Questions? No questions?
I have a question.
Does someone want to explain?
Mr. Chair, I do have a question. So you propose 100 million this year, next year, the year after, for the next 20 years, is that correct?
Yeah, for the next 30 years, for 20.
30 years,
yeah.
okay. So this year, how would that affect our current numbers? Do you know? Like, what's currently, so the money's available, where would it come from?
Right.
I'm looking at the fiscal
Well,
amount.
I can tell you this, and I don't know if it's news to you, but we're going to be putting well over $300 million into the LSRA in a very short time.
How much?
Over 300 million.
Okay.
Is going to be going into that. So I'm looking at, hopefully, that we'd have two funds, one that was basically for education, and one that was basically for other general fund concerns. Those are what I'd really like to try to get to. I originally started with $2 billion, a year. I said, no, let's figure out how we can, put a small amount of money in relationship to the amount of money we make every year.
Okay.
That will basically lend to a perpetual investment opportunity. And you only have to do this once, because at the end of the 30 years, you'll roll out $600 million and keep $1 billion. Then at the end of that next 30 years, you would roll out, basically $6 billion and keep $10 billion. And then that $10 billion would go ahead and turn into well over $100 billion that would go into the next cycle. And so those are the rate of growth that you would have. And when you look at the.
Well, I'll stop you, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair. I totally understand, and I think you're just trying to bring some financial planning into the state. That's good from my perspective. I'll just say, I agree with most of what you said, except for, we have been around for 250 years. We won't be around for another 250 years unless we turn back to the Lord as a nation. I just have to say that, because we just need to turn back.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
let's,
I do believe that. We have some social issues to deal with.
Mr. Treasurer, let's go over the amendments then.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Let me grab the bill, grab my glasses so I can see what it is. I think when I was reading it through, I thought that there was a little skip in the first part of it, but essentially what we're doing here is trying to make it so the accountants can account for all of this.
So where are we now? What page are we
So
on?
we go to page 3.
Okay,
Go to page 3 and lines 19 through 21.
okay,
Where it says transfers made under this subsection C of this section, and investment of those transfers shall be in accordance in all the following. We go over to the next page and we delete Romanet I, Romanet 2, Romanet 3. The first one is the separately accounts. What we want to do for both investment purposes and accounting purposes is mirror the same thing that we're doing with our total return funds, where we're going to have the same investments in our permanent mineral funds and our common school fund. So it makes the accounting a lot easier that if we have one pool. So in this, we're essentially making one pool. Then we get out of account transfer shall not be withdrawn from the account. We're making sure that once the money is in there, that it actually continues to compound. Because compounding is the whole reason that you get the excess returns. Then we go into the investment earnings for each annual transfer shall not be withdrawn, because we're not going to have annual transfers, basically. We're going to have a periodic transfer, and it'll begin, roughly in every 30 years. Now, if we get the same returns that we have now, that's really only every 22 years that 100 million would turn into 1.6. We look at a distribution of 37.5% of the investment earnings of the generational account that is going to be attributable to the distribution. And the remaining part of that would be your 62+% would remain in the next cycle. Now, there's 2 scenarios that we put forth in our graphs. And one of them is if you do a billion and keep back 600 million, or you transfer 600 million and keep back $1 billion. Really, I think.
yes, Mr. Vice Chair.
Yeah.
You got 5 minutes, or we hold
Okay.
over till tomorrow.
So, all right, let's just keep going through this. We define investment earnings. It includes interest, dividends, and realized capital gains. And then we move in there and look at our report, includes information on the annual review of the accounts, investment policy statement, and estimated investment earnings available for deposit to the general fund at the next following date of a distribution of the account. That basically, the report, for whatever reason, Don wanted to reduce that. We go through and make conforming amendments, which adds to section 94227. And then we will go into the area here of 94716, which expands the investment of a specific fund or account. That's attributing to changing for the generational fund to the 85-15 rather than the 70-30.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm on page 4, line 17. I don't know if that reads right with the deletions.
Yeah. And
So
I
maybe-
don't know if it reads right either, because I told Dawn that we had to put some of this stuff back in and use attributable to. She just changed the attributable to on that. That's going to need a little wordsmithing there, because it doesn't flow for me either, Senator.
Right,
Yeah.
it's not reading right
No.
Yeah, no,
on
it's
that
not.
section.
Yeah, what I'm going to do is, I don't want to rush this. Clearly, we're not going to be done in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's my intent that we go into Friday with this particular bill. I think we're going to have a big day tomorrow, a lot of work tomorrow. And I actually think to do this right, we're going to probably have to have a morning and a noon recess. So we'll have that notice out today, but the committee just expect to have a morning session and then a resume to a noon recess.
Yeah,
So-
Mr. Chairman, I'll make sure that we get that wordsmith right, so it actually flows.
And I want to be fair to you, Mr. Treasurer.
Yeah.
I don't want to rush this. It
Yeah.
means as much to you as us, so.
Yeah.
And, you know, if we have some time, you know, after the meeting, if anybody wants to talk about how we fund this and what level we fund at it and why it's important, so we don't burn a lot of time tomorrow, you know, I'd love to have those sidebar conversations. That's all right with you.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer.
Okay.
Then I will close this meeting until tomorrow morning. Mr. Chairman.
Yep.